All right. I'm Christina and
I'm Max.
And I'm Mike.
And we're here today to talk to Mike Watson from the Holden Arboretum in Cleveland, Ohio. Mike, do you want to do a quick introduction of yourself?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Mike Watson. I am the conservation biologist at Holden Arboretum, which is a joint organization of Holden Arboretum and Cleveland Botanical Gardens. So I work primarily at the Arboretum campus, and part of my job is overseeing our long-running bluebird conservation program, which is a nest box monitoring program that's been going since 1965. So.
Yes, and Max, you've seen the bluebirds. You've gotten to go out there with your grandma and take a look at them,
It's
right?
been interesting. It's like, well, they do a lot of maintenance, including checking out some bugs, checking on how they're doing, and seeing like when they leave and when they come back again.
Yeah. And Mike, you were saying that you've been collecting that data since all the way back from 1965 at Holden?
Yeah, so we're not, at least I haven't been able to pin down the date that the first nest box was installed. The best I can do is early 60s, but we know that they started collecting data in 1965, and that's been weekly or bi-weekly visits to every nest box throughout the nesting season, collecting the same kind of data since 1965. So it's it may be the longest running continuous bluebird nesting program in the state, as far as we're aware. So
yeah, so you have quite a bit of data that you've collected, but probably both anecdotally and like you were talking about before we started recording, probably looking at some of the statistics, really able to see the impacts of climate change when it comes to the bluebirds and other birds that sometimes try to nest in the same space as the bluebirds then, right?
Yeah. So we've got with a long data set like that, and it's long enough that we know there have been changes in the climate in that time period, and we have working in an area that's relatively close to one of the Great Lakes. I think our climate is moderated by that giant mass of cold water. So I think there have been measurable changes in our climate, but they're not as dramatic as in some parts of the country. But even so, we can see that there have been changes. And so then there's obviously the question, have we seen any response from the birds in this case?
Yeah.
And so one of the things we were talking about earlier was that working with a colleague at Malone University who's trying to do an analysis of that with tree swallows, which is another bird species that uses the same nest boxes that our eastern bluebirds do. And his analysis hasn't been published yet, but he's seeing what looks like shifts in kind of when and how the tree swallows choose to nest that seems to be a response to changes in the local climate. So, and then I can add to that I did before I talked to him, I did a very basic comparison of nest timing for tree swallows in the first 15 years of Holden's program and the most recent 15 years. And it's a really basic level, and I'm sure the stats, aren't perfect and could be improved, but there was a shift of, it was over 5 to 7 days earlier in the season. It appeared to me that tree swallows were nesting earlier now than they used to. And I did a similar thing with bluebirds, and the bluebirds did not appear to have shifted their timing at all. And so that was something that got me starting to think about the strategies of these two species and why they may or may not shift over time. If you're hearing a lot of noise, we have hail right now. I'm looking up.
Oh my gosh.
It looks like it's pea size or maybe a little bit bigger than pea size bouncing around out there. So hopefully that's short-lived. But
well, I'll have to call my mom after this to make sure she's okay.
Yeah. We've got some trees down and stuff up in this area. So
yeah.
But yeah, the little bit I had done before I talked to Jason and started working with him suggested that we were seeing some of these shifts with tree swallows. Now, tree swallows are a bird that's a long distant migrant. So they're coming up in the spring and they don't get here. When they get here, ideally they have been moving and staying in sync with local insect emergences so that they always have food as they're moving north. And so
Mhm.
if our springs are warming up and hatches are happening sooner and there's more insects available earlier, then they could try to shift their nesting earlier. Bluebirds
Mhm.
are here year round, or maybe travel just a short distance. And so they seem to just start when things are right for them, and it's right. So we haven't seen a lot of shift on the bluebirds, but we seem to see that the tree swallows creeping earlier in the season, which is interesting because bluebirds tend to nest first, and then the tree swallows show up, and so they're sharing. They're nesting side by side for a little while, but if
Yeah.
the tree swallows creep earlier, are we going to see more competition? So, long story short, when I did this really rough analysis, it got me starting to think about these two birds that seem to almost cooperate or share space pretty well. Are they going to start competing more and more?
Fighting. Yeah.
Nesting space. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting. All right. I know you have a question.
I have a
Hit it.
question. So we know that global warming is affecting the times, right? And we know that there was at one point a set time that they always went to, but now it's changing, right? But let's pretend we roll it back at the very end of the year, December 31st. Would it like immediately go back to that set amount? And when it does, regardless of how long it takes, is it guaranteed that they'll go back to that original time, or they could go like just stay here or go back farther?
You mean like if we fix climate change and
Yeah.
it's now no longer an issue and it's the same as it was in 1965?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, that's an interesting. Yeah, if you could snap your fingers and it's back
Yeah.
to
Who's that guy from Marvel movies?
1965.
Yeah.
Thanos.
Thanos
decided
We're
to come
back.
back and
Yeah.
snap it out of existence.
That's a really interesting question. I would imagine that. So one of the advantages that birds have is that they are very mobile. They can move around fast, and they have, for better or worse, relatively short lifespans. So they're, I think, able to adapt relatively quickly to climate change. The things we're worried about are trees and plants that if the climate shifts away from them, they don't move that fast, right?
Yeah.
So I would think you might see a few years of stumbles and things aren't working out so well. But that's a good question. Would they just stick with what they have? I think if it returned to the mid 60s and our springs were less warm than they are now, they would be forced to shift, and they would have to do it pretty quickly. And so there would probably be a few really tough years in there. We see it even now. If you've got an unusually cold spring, we'll see really high mortality rates in the spring because they're trying to migrate north and stay with that timing. And if you get an extended cold spell or ice storms, you see a lot of mortality. So I would imagine they've got something programmed in their system now. And if you had a really sudden shift, it would take them a bit to shift back.
Yeah.
But because they're more flexible than, say, a tree, I think it could happen. So yeah, that's an interesting question.
Yeah.
So I also have a question. So, I mean, the amount of data and statistics you can draw from what seems like just sort of kind of a passive activity, these bluebird boxes have turned out to be a wealth of scientific data, right?
Right.
But there's a wealth of different fauna there at Holden and, the botanical gardens and things of that nature. So are there any other programs that you're able to sort of maybe collect some data, be it like the salamanders that are in the creek over at Penitentiary Glen or any other, animals that just because you've had these programs, they've now been able to turn them into sort of a surprise gold mine for climate research and things like that?
So I think my job is, like the Bluebird program is a big part of my job, but my job is mostly wildlife related, although because conservation is a small group, I get pulled into a lot of other things. None of our other wildlife programs do we have a data set that runs that long. The closest would be just like general bird survey stuff.
Mhm.
They've been doing spring bird counts through the Audubon Society at Holden at least back to the 60s. Holden was founded in the 30s. And I don't know how quickly after that they started doing spring bird surveys. So you might be able to pull data there when they're looking at what birds are present in April and May, and see if that changes. Birds are very sensitive to habitat, so the habitat Holden has changed a lot in that time, just from Holden expanding and changing its garden.
Yeah.
So that becomes tricky. But none of the other data sets that I'm involved with, I think, could directly address it. Holden does have, through our horticulture department, they have a phenology study where they've got, I don't even know how many different varieties of plants, but they've got plants in a large fenced-in area, and then there's some that are outside, and they've got volunteers that go around, and all through the spring, they're tracking the phenology, which is the timing of their flowering and fruit set.
Mhm.
And that's something, I don't know how long they've been doing that, but just talking to other people at Holden, I think they're seeing some shifts
Yeah.
with the phenology of plants flowering sooner or setting fruit sooner and stuff like that. And that's another, that's one that Holden, I think, initiated because they were interested in those particular plants. And if you've ever heard of the term growing degree days, that's something that's used in horticulture because insects and plants are highly synchronized. And so if you see, and I don't know these, but so I'm just going to give an example that's probably incorrect.
Mhm.
If you see red bud at full flower,
Yeah.
that's the same, they're on the same timing as a certain pest insect that then you would know, okay, it's time to potentially
Mhm.
start managing that insect pest. So I think early on the interest was understanding
Oh,
the timing
interesting.
and phenology
Yeah.
to help with integrated pest management maybe. And now it's again, it's kind of a surprise, like you said, a surprise gold mine that these data may be used elsewhere to better understand how things are changing with climate change. So.
Maybe less of a question, but more of a statement. But I mean, Holden and its other sort of sister facilities there, people look at them as pretty places, but listening to you, it's like it's really an amazing sort of test bed for some really cool science.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things, I mean, I think one of the things that Holden kind of struggles with, and I think we do a pretty good job of, but in the past, distinguishing ourselves from like the local metro parks, because people see us as a pretty place to go and do a hike, and they don't necessarily know about, we have a research department that publishes all kinds of research related to certain horticulture questions, but also a lot of ecology. And that's been growing over the last 10 or 12 years. And they're trying to, build that understanding in the community that we're not just a place to go and take a hike, but it's horticultural testing and experimentation. It's conservation, it's field research, it's ecological research. It's a lot of different things that we try to do at Holden because we have a slightly different mission statement than what a metro park would have. So.
So are there things that, like, as a private citizen, we can do to help with some of that research? I know just through like scrolling through my phone year over year since we've been at, we were at home during the pandemic, noticing like when our peonies bloomed, and it was like very different from year to year. And, is there a place where we can help provide information or help Holden with some of their research that they're doing?
That's a good question. In terms of the phenology, I don't know. There might be citizen science projects now related to plant phenology, but I don't know of any. Holden's data all go to the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, what's called the Nest Watch program. So we collect all these data, and I manage our own internal database, and that's what I use for our analysis. But then we also send all of our data to Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and we've been doing that since the start in 1965. And so the Cornell Lab has, I don't even know how many millions of nest monitoring data sets from decades and decades from all across the planet. And so that's a citizen science project where any nest that you find, as long as you can monitor it safely, you can use more or less the same protocols we use for our bluebirds. Visit it once a week, take note of whose it is, eggs, young, how old the young are, all that stuff.
Yeah.
And then report it to Nest Watch. And so they'll accept nest data from any species anywhere on the planet, I think. And so it's become this huge central database, of bird nesting data. And so people are using, scientists can then go to that and pull those data. But there's a bunch of different kinds of citizen science projects they're usually linked to things that are like birds that are relatively easy to monitor and kind of where to find them and how to find them. But yeah, the idea of a phenology thing, it seems like that would be one that would be a good fit, because they could have specific plants that they're most interested in, and then you just tell where you are and then you track it over time. So that would be an interesting one I don't know of, but if it's not happening, it probably should.
Yeah. I'm sure we could scour that internet. Somebody's got to be doing that, right? But yeah. So I think one of the things about climate change that I am becoming more appreciative of is that in order to see what that change is, you have to have years of data, because it is sometimes fast, with like the big storms and things that come up, you can see, oh, wow, that's different than last year. But some of it is just such small incremental change that you really have to be able to study that over time.
Sometimes it's by minutes, sometimes it's by days.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's by decades.
Yeah. So having that longevity of a study is really, really important to scientists right now, I would think.
Yeah. I mean, and that's part of the reason I'm glad that, like, for the project, the guy I'm working with at Malone University, is the distinction between climate and weather, and understanding how, when you analyze the data, you're not just accounting, or you're not just seeing effects from freak weather events. Because you can have, like I think it was 77, 78, those 2 winters in Northeast Ohio were horrible. Yeah. And people talked about, winter survival of bluebirds was really low. And so the bluebird population tanked, and it was just 2 really weird winters. And I don't know how well it's understood what triggered those 2 really extreme winters back to back. But I'm sure if you're sitting in your house, or you're trying to shovel 4 feet of snow in 1977, you're like, this isn't, what's this climate change thing? Yeah. But these are little blips, and like you said, it's this long-term increasing. And so you have to have that long data set, and then you have to have statistics that can really deal with that. Around us with the Bluebird program, I've been managing Holden's Bluebird since 2007. So I'm starting to get where I feel like I know kind of what it used to be and what it is now. And the thing we've been dealing with most recently, which doesn't necessarily feel like it would be the obvious result of climate change, is our springs tend to be more dramatically up and down. So we'll get warm days, and then it'll just plummet, and we'll get these cold days that feel unseasonably cold, and more precipitation. And so, I sometimes track those growing degree days, and a growing degree day is basically a way to measure over the year how much heat has been added to the system. Mm-hmm. And so we'll get up to a certain number, and then it just kind of flatlines for a while. We just don't have, we're just staying below what you would expect for that time for the spring. And so our birds are responding to that. And then it kind of like breaks, and then it goes back up to more normal or above normal. So we're having these really weird springs where it's unpredictable, colder than you might expect, and wetter than you might expect. If you're just thinking about climate change as being global warming, we're getting these weird, cold, wet, unpredictable things. It's really throwing the birds for a loop sometimes.
Right. Well, Mike, it was great talking to you today. Thank you for telling us a little bit about Holden, and certainly around the Bluebird program. I know that my mom loves doing it, and the boys have really enjoyed getting to go with her and see them every year in the spring. Good. Yes. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. We'll talk to you later.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay, bye.